As always, it's great to have a great group here for our Trust Talk this week. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Adler. Peter has been, got his PhD from Penn State, and is a native of West Virginia. He's been at Clemson University for over 30 years, and we have lots of topics to pick from. He's going to talk to one tonight about endangered species and the other side of the story you often don't hear about. But in addition, he works with engineers. As an entomologist, though, they're looking at the structure of proboscis of butterflies and moths from an engineering perspective. So maybe we can get him back sometime with that. He also works with the genetics of insects that transmit diseases. So he's got a broad background. Tonight, he's going to be talking about insects that bite that make a difference on endangered species. So it'll weave multiple stories together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Thank you for coming down to speak with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all for the opportunity to, as it turns out, step back into my childhood. And by that, I mean stepping back to the late 1950s, early 1960s, when I used to come down to Hilton Head Island with my family and spend the summers there. The island at that time was rather primeval, at least in certain areas. We had these giant live oak trees draped with Spanish moss and little green frogs everywhere and giant yellow moths with purple spots. And you know, for a little boy that was fascinated by nature, it was paradise. And so today, thanks to Chris and your spectacular surroundings here, I got to step back into my own personal history and experience my childhood sort of vicariously again. Well, I'm going to talk to you about something that is of great interest to me and that I think has a profound influence on the natural world. And yet at the same time, it's an influence and it's an aspect of nature that a lot of people really aren't aware of.
Oh my God.
Yeah, maybe the lights, at least on the front, so you could just...
That's great. Oh yes, that's doing it well.
Maybe, is that better?
Yes. That's better.
All right, so the poet laureate for Britain in the 1800s was Sir Alfred Lord Tennyson. And it was Tennyson who penned these familiar words, nature red in tooth and claw. Now I suspect that this is what Tennyson had in mind. You know, these giant carnivores ripping the limbs off of helpless prey and creating a bloodbath. I'm not sure Tennyson really understood how profoundly accurate he really was, because much of what is going on in terms of bloodletting in nature is a result of these little creatures. These are the biting flies. And I have enlarged the head. Here's the head. And here's the business part of the head. Right? Those are what we technically call the mouth parts. There's a set of 4 of those blades, and I've taken one of those blades and enlarged it here under the electron microscope. This is tiny, but imagine this thing going into your skin, as it does. That was my arm in the first picture that that fly was sitting on. And these things, with those little fish hook-like hooks, will anchor the mouth parts, and then with another set of mouth parts, because remember they have 4, they're going to snip and cut until you've really got a bloody mess. Okay. This is a bit daunting. We have more than 13,000 species of these little creatures in the world, each one doing something different. Each one lives somewhere different. Each one active at a different part of the year. Each one's feeding on a different host animal. All right, there are lots of different kinds of biting flies, but the 4 general categories are our friend the mosquito, the black fly, which I'll talk about mostly tonight, the horsefly and its cousin the deer fly, and the one that you were experiencing today, the biting midge. And that's blood in the abdomen of one of my colleagues. You know, these things go by a lot of names. No-see-ums, punkies, sand fleas, winged fire, winged Adams, wings with teeth, so on. So, you know, it's all the same. All right, well, here's the sort of unpleasant aspect of this. I mean, it really is tragic. Because biting flies reach the circulatory system, they're able to transmit pathogens and parasites, bacteria, viruses, protozoans, little microscopic worms, and these things cause diseases. This is a disease that is horrific. It's not well known. It's in much of tropical and subtropical Africa. It's in parts of South America. It's called river blindness, and it does cause irreversible and permanent damage to the eyes in many different ways. Destroys the optic nerve, and this is transmitted by a black fly. Well, it's not just humans that are going to be susceptible to these diseases like malaria and yellow fever and so forth. It's also wildlife. All the wild animals out there are subject to attack by biting flies. And if a biting fly is feeding, then chances are it is going to transmit some kind of parasite. This happens to be a one-celled protozoan. These are blood cells here. This is the parasite. And that particular parasite causes a disease that's very much like malaria, but it's found in birds. This is an example I worked with some years ago. This is Atwater's prairie chicken. There are only about 60 of these birds left in the wild. And so, you know, if you have these black flies taking blood and you have the parasites that are causing disease, there's some risk. Now, fortunately, the people who deal with the conservation of the Atwater's prairie chicken have the information, and it's part of their management program now. Well, one of the places that I like to visit for my summer vacation is the North Country. Siberia, the Northwest Territories, Alaska, anything north of the Arctic Circle, because that's where biting flies rule the world. And that's not to say that they're not down here doing a bit of ruling. But, all right, imagine this. This is a herd of caribou up in the Northwest Territories. Just imagine this. We've got an area about a hectare, that's about 2.5 acres, capable of producing 30 million mosquitoes per day. Okay? And then down here, coming out of the rivers, we can have more than 1 billion of these black flies boiling out of the rivers. 1 kilometer of river produces this onslaught per day. All right. Now, just as a, yeah.
When you say black flies, do you mean those regular everyday flies we see all the time?
No, no. These are. This is a specific name that is given, and they bite. The houseflies don't. Houseflies are black, but they don't bite. Not all black flies are black, but they all bite. Okay, are you sufficiently confused? That sounded confusing to me.
Clear as cut glass.
Yeah, okay. One point that's important, mosquitoes breed in standing water. All right, so they're in snow pools, rain pools, puddles, ponds. Black flies breed exclusively in flowing water. Okay, so it has to be running fresh water, streams and rivers. What in the world is going to happen to these animals? You know, well, here's an example of the caribou calf. And if you can see this pestilence here. And this is a mild cloud of flies. I've canoed in the Northwest Territories, and when the caribou cross in front of you, you don't want to be coming through right after that, because all of the flies lift off of the caribou, and your greatest danger is that you're going to inhale this cloud of flies. They're so thick and so dense. All right, needless to say, if they're attacking wildlife, if they're attacking us, they're also attacking our livestock. They are a significant problem, all biting flies for livestock. These are black flies attacking cattle. There are enough black flies here that they will kill the cattle, and they do so either by taking out so much blood that it becomes too thick to transport the oxygen efficiently and the cattle suffocate, or you have all these little salivary chemicals that are being injected by the fly, so that the blood will continue to flow. They inject anticoagulants. It's like going to the drugstore, just dumping everything into the wound they've cut. There are anticoagulants and anesthetics and everything you need to do really surgical blood work. Right? And the problem with those compounds that are injected is that they can cause toxic shock, which kills the animal. Well, this is a common loon. It was photographed out in British Columbia. You can see the black flies clustered around the bill, and they're on the head, and they go under the feathers. And this poor bird was sitting on its nest, and it just stayed tight. It did not leave the nest.
Great.
All right. Well, I painted a pretty bleak picture here for biting flies. The question is, well, what good are they, for crying out loud? Well, in fact, there are always two sides to every story, and certainly there's a good side to the biting flies. They're wonderful pollinators. They provide the food base for fish and for birds and reptiles, amphibians. You might not be aware of this aspect. When you travel in some areas, for example, Sweden, especially in the North Country, you see these river valleys that just have this beautiful green, lush vegetation. And say, my goodness, this is just great. And they grow wonderful agricultural crops in that little short window of summer. And the reason that they can do that is because of the black flies. This is a larva. Remember, the black flies live in flowing water. And these larvae are so dense. Here's a carpet on the bottom of the river. Right? I call this standing room only. Imagine an entire river for miles and miles coated with these larvae, each one of which will produce a fly. Well, there are so many of these in some of these northern rivers that they can produce enough fecal matter, in this case 430 tons when it's dried out. It goes past a line across a river every day. And so when the river goes over into its floodplain, it drops all those fecal pellets, and you get this wonderful natural fertilization that promotes great agriculture. All right, well, great horned owl in a rehabilitation center. This was photographed by a colleague in, I believe it was Mississippi. And you can see the black flies. They're around the eyes. Here they are. They're crawling on the eye. They're around the base of the bill. They're on the head. They're in the ears. They get under the feathers. And there are eruptions every once in a while. There was one several years ago along the Gulf Coast. And a lot of birds died. Birds in rehabilitation centers died. But it's a tragedy. But it also gives us a little bit of insight. Because, the hosts that are used by most species of blood-feeding flies just aren't known. We're dealing with 13,000 plus species. Every one of those species of biting fly is doing something different. Some feed only on birds. Some feed only on mammals. Within the mammal group, some feed only on rodents. Within the rodent group, some feed only on certain rodents. There's a species that feeds only on common loons, and on and on. So we just don't have enough information. And that becomes problematic when we're trying to address a problem either with our domestic animals like cattle or with ourselves, or with endangered wildlife, as you'll see in a little bit. All right, so the question is, how do we get this information about hosts of biting flies? This is the way I used to do it. The reason I'm here is because I'm not foolish anymore. But I used to be, and I survived. This is a bison in nature. It's not in a park. That's me, and I've got a butterfly net there. Just, if I wanted the flies, I was going to get the flies. And, grizzly bear, it didn't matter. Climbing high trees to get up to the nests of the owls so that I could pick the flies off and figure out, what's eating the flies. All right. You're only foolish when you're young, so when you get a little bit more wisdom, if you do, you change your ways. So we had to come up with a different way of sampling these flies to figure out what they're feeding on. All right, so here's what we did. I went to northern Sweden. Yes, I like the North Country, and Sweden's beautiful. I had a colleague up there I worked with for many years. We decided that we would try a different strategy. And so what we did is we got this netting material, and my colleague's wife sewed this net together, and we mounted it onto this metal frame on top of my colleague's car. Now this is high tech, okay? Because here at the other end is a plastic Coke bottle. And so we would drive along and talk about science and world politics while the flies are being collected into this trap, and then at the end of our traveling, we would take the lid off of our high-tech Coke bottle there and dump the flies out. All right, well, here's what happened. Okay, after 3 years of doing this, we had collected more than 67,000 female black flies. We identified them all, and we sorted them out from all the chaff, like the mosquitoes and anything else that was flying. We were only interested in the females, because the males don't feed on blood. And that's true for male mosquitoes. It's true for the male biting midges, the no-see-ums. The males are harmless. They're just feeding on sugary things like plant nectar, floral nectar. Okay, but what we were looking for were these flies that had blood in them. Here's an example. Blood is in the abdomen. It's taking a blood meal from a human, and then it's going to fly away, and it's going to hide somewhere and digest the blood and convert that blood to eggs. We had to catch those flies before they went into hiding and converted the blood to eggs. We were lucky to get 200 of these. All right, then what we did was we took the DNA out, and we used a little sequence of that DNA to identify what that blood belonged to. What animal did that blood in that fly come from?
Oh, my goodness.
All right, so what we found out was quite a bit, and I won't burden you with everything, but in our 200 flies, we had 17 different species. They had fed on the blood of 25 different vertebrate species. There were 12 species of mammals and 13 species of birds. We found that moose was used commonly, and the black grouse was used commonly. So we were curious, why are they using these particular hosts more than the others? Yes, they were going after all kinds of different hosts, but these are the ones that showed up in our analysis most often. So how does a little fly, that's the size of a pinhead, flying around out there, find these animals, and how does it decide what it's going to feed on? Well, the Swedes are very good about knowing their birds and everything about their birds in great detail. And so we were able to plot the size of the birds in northern Sweden, where we trapped the flies, against the number of individuals of each species. And what we found was that the host birds that these flies were using tended to be the real big birds, like the capercaillie. It's a grouse-like bird. And they would use the birds that were extremely abundant, like this tiny willow warbler, which once I learned the song, It was everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It was in, shopping mall parking lots, and it was deep in the forest. And so you have big targets and lots of targets. And that's what the flies prefer. All right. Well, now, let's take a real life situation that I've been involved with for a while. And this involves endangered species. What happens when you have these flies that are normally doing fine with the wildlife? The wildlife populations may suffer one year, but they come back and they cycle around some average. But an endangered species, if it takes a little dip, that might be it. And so the biting flies might just push that bird or that mammal into extinction. Now, that's where I come in. This is maybe the poster child for wildlife conservation in the United States. This is the magnificent whooping crane. It's the tallest bird in North America. Yeah, it was on the ropes in the 1940s. On planet Earth, there were only 21 birds. That was it. Now, through the efforts of a lot of very dedicated people, there are now 603 birds. A lot of those are in captivity, but there are about half of those, or a little more, in nature. And we have some that every winter, almost every winter, will spend their winter in the Ace Basin. Some of you may have been fortunate enough to have seen one. Well, because this bird is really still on the brink of extinction, and disease going through one population could, put a significant dent in the species recovery. There's been this 20-year, 25-year attempt almost to reintroduce the species into where it used to occur, eastern North America. And I spoke with Jeff. Jeff, the prime breeding area for the whooping crane was Chicago. So there's no hope, of getting the whooping crane back to where it used to breed.
This
So
is the prettiest thing I've ever looked at.
it's a magnificent thing, and if we're lucky enough, this is something we can routinely see. But we're going to have to get it somewhere besides Chicago because it's not going to make it there. And so they've tried some reintroduction areas. And it's really a remarkable story of success on one level and failure on another. Here's part of the success. These birds, when they're reintroduced, for example, in Wisconsin, they have to get down to Florida where they're going to spend the winter. And they don't know how to do that. They've never learned from, their parents, because their parents didn't learn. These are all raised birds and then brought out into the wild. And so there are these brave people who dress up in a crane outfit. And they fly these ultralight aircraft from Wisconsin down to Florida with these birds in tow. Okay. And so it's been remarkably successful. These things just do a wonderful job of migrating thanks to that program. They survive beautifully in the reintroduction area, which happens to be a part of Wisconsin. The birds molt perfectly. They court and they mate with no problems. They make wonderful nests. A little sloppy, but they're whooping crane nests, and they're wonderful. Okay, everything is wonderful until they've got eggs, and then they just get up and they leave. All right, so my colleagues and I have looked at why. Why are they getting up? They do all this stuff so well, and then at the end, when they've got chicks just weeks away, why do they give up? And they don't come back. Well, we've tested some hypotheses. Maybe in this reintroduction area, there's just not enough food. I mean, we're not a crane. We can evaluate and monitor, but maybe it's just not enough or the right kind of food. This is on a national wildlife refuge where they're being reintroduced, and so people are there. Maybe they're disturbing them. Maybe the birds delay too much to incubate. Maybe the predation is too heavy. Water level it's required for nesting. Maybe it's just not right at the reintroduction area. After these birds return from their migration, they're exhausted. Maybe they just don't have the reserves to hang in there on the nest and make it. Maybe the nest habitat characteristics are wrong. Again, we're not whooping cranes, so maybe the reintroduction area isn't appropriate. Maybe the nesting pairs are a bit inexperienced. Okay, but they've been nesting now for quite a number of years, same pairs over and over, and they do the same things. Okay, well maybe it's the biting flies, maybe. All right, well we tested these hypotheses. My colleagues worked very diligently to look at these. We're crossing them out because they're not playing the major driving force to move those birds off the nests. Yes, there is predation. Yes, there are fluctuations in the water level, and that can influence whether or not one or two nests are successful. But what in the world is causing this massive abandonment of the nests? Virtually every nest is abandoned. That brings us down to the biting flies, and where I come in. Okay, well, these are some fuzzy whooping crane eggs. This is typical nesting material. You can see these are reeds that have been assembled by the birds. And if you look closely, the fuzzy eggs are just festooned with black flies. And they're crawling all over the nesting material. And they're in this dense swarm that's all over the place. And it's just unpleasant. Here's a close-up of one of those eggs. These flies are, if we can give them human characteristics, I'd say they're just they're crazy. They're in a frenzy. They're just crawling maddeningly around. They don't feed on these eggs. They can't punch their little mouth parts through. But the crane has been sitting here, and so the odor of the crane is now on the eggs, and that just drives them crazy. Here's what they're really after. Okay, this is a female whooping crane. Now, in this picture, I counted about 400 flies. That's just what I could see. They're under the feathers. You can see blood here. It's dripping down. There's a blood droplet there. They're going under the feathers, so I can't count those. I can't count those on the other side, but they're withdrawing about 1.2 milliliters of blood in 5 minutes. So these poor birds, you can imagine, they're sitting out there on the nests, and this cloud of flies. If you look at this area up here, okay, it's black here. It should be red, just like here. And they like this thinly feathered area. The reason the head is red here is because the capillary beds are very close to the surface, and so it's easy for the flies to get their blood meal there, and they tend to congregate right there. All right, well, these birds out there, they'll sit stoically. They'll just sit there, and then they'll start, moving their head around and flicking and tossing the head, and they'll start poking at the egg, and, inevitably some of the eggs are going to be broken by the cranes. So if they don't get up and abandon them, then sometimes they also end up breaking them nonetheless. So when that happens, the flies just increase their level of frenzy, and they often end up being stuck in here. This is an egg of a whooping crane that I was given. Most of the contents had leaked out onto the nest, but what was still in here had more than 2,200 black flies, sort of fossilized in here. So it gave us a pretty good idea of what species were coming into the cranes and the kinds of numbers. All right, so this is the question we asked. What is the role of the black flies in the crane nest failure? And to give an idea, when the flies are active, and if they're active at the time that the cranes are leaving the nest, we did a little monitoring. We set up these traps in the nesting area, and we relied on carbon dioxide. When you breathe, or when you're just standing, you're producing carbon dioxide, and that's what attracts the flies. So if you don't want to attract flies, don't be alive. Because if you're alive, you're producing carbon dioxide. Okay, and it brings them in, it can bring them in from 100 feet away. We get our carbon dioxide when dry ice changes from a solid to a gas. We have this collecting bag below the dry ice, And here's a little plastic container at the bottom where the flies accumulate. We've got a suction fan right here that is powered by this battery. So the flies come in with the carbon dioxide and they get sucked into the trap, and then we've got them. At the same time, we were putting out these whooping crane decoys. We used real whooping crane wings to give the odor of the cranes. And we put these glue boards on top of the head. They were standard size, and we left them out for a standardized period of time to trap the flies that came in. And you can see there's a big cluster of biting flies on the top of the head there. At the same time we were doing the fly monitoring, my colleagues tried to monitor the birds at their nests to see if they might be able to associate the fly abundance with abandonment of the nest. So infrared cameras were used, there were observation blinds. The problem is if you get too close, you frighten the birds away, and that's certainly not acceptable. Well, this is what it looks like for one trap in one day. I mean, every biting fly in the neighborhood comes into the carbon dioxide. There are mosquitoes, there are horse flies, there are no-see-ums in there. At the end of our trapping period, we had collected more than 1/3 of these flies from our carbon dioxide traps and this sort of thing. And the glue boards collected almost 2,000. And so what that did was it allowed us to see what species were active, when they were active, and how it compared with when the cranes were nesting and abandoning. So let me just briefly lead you through this. Here are our 3 species of black flies. We have this one that comes on in great numbers from early in April until the beginning of May. A second species comes on in smaller numbers, and a third comes later in smaller numbers. Every red bar represents a nesting attempt by a whooping crane. The red ones, which is every one of these, means nest abandoned. From 2005 to 2010, every one of these was abandoned. Okay, green nest down here means not abandoned. What you see is something interesting happening here, right? All of these nests that were initiated from the 1st of April to about the 3rd week failed. These that were initiated either as second attempts or later tended to fare a little better. Okay. Well, at the same time that we were watching the whooping cranes, we were also watching the Sandhill Cranes. And the Sandhill Cranes also are attacked by black flies. Here's a mess of them up there on this red area of the head. But here is a chick. So the Sandhill Cranes did not leave their nest for the most part, and they produced chicks. So here in the same area, you have the Sandhill Cranes apparently doing fine, and the whooping cranes doing miserably. What in the world is going on? All right, so let's just take 1 year, this is 2010, and compare the whooping cranes and the Sandhill Cranes. Here are our whooping cranes. They start nesting here in April, and then they just abandon the nest. If they start later, those that started later, you had some success. Doesn't mean they hatched a chick, but at least they didn't get up and leave the eggs. Now look at the Sandhill Cranes. The Sandhill Cranes do not begin nesting until maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks or more later, and for the most part, they tend not to leave the nest. Yes, some are abandoned, but for the most part, they don't leave. Why the difference here? Well, the whooping cranes are raised in Patuxent, Maryland, here. They are then transported to the reintroduction site in central Wisconsin, here. That's 640 kilometers directly northward that they have to go. Well, these birds are raised here, and so they are cued to the seasonality of the latitude of Patuxent, Maryland. When you put them up here in Wisconsin, they're still cued to do everything as though they were in Maryland. So what that means is that they're going to start nesting earlier. All right, we've got some pretty good evidence here that the black flies are causing these cranes to leave their nests. Now we're going to ask the serious question. Do black flies actually cause nest failure. All right, so we had to come up with an experiment. And our experiment was to get rid of the black flies. All right, to remove them, or at least suppress them to the extent that they were a minimal issue on the landscape of the reintroduction area. So you'll remember that black fly, as immatures, are going to be found in flowing water. These are the larvae of the black fly. They're attached to a blade of grass, and this is how they feed as larvae. They have this pair of fans that comes off the head, and they just lean into the current, and it's like room service. All the little particles are captured by these fans. Okay? So we decided that we would eliminate the larvae of the black flies from their breeding sites. It took us about 3 years to put the experiment in place, to get the necessary permissions and go through the agencies for doing this 2-year experiment. All right, first thing we did was figure out where our target species of black flies were breeding. This is a Google Earth map. This is one of the crane nesting areas, and here's the other crane nesting areas. They're a couple miles in between. And here is where these yellow lines, that's where the black flies would have to be removed. It turns out to be about 80 kilometers. We would have to clear 80 kilometers of the black flies in order to do this experiment. We'd have to do it for 2 years. All right, here's a typical breeding site for the black flies. Any object in this river is going to be coated with the larvae. Here I pulled a leaf out, and these things are an incredible density, 50 larvae per centimeter squared. I mean, they're really clustered in there. And every tree that hangs in, every leaf that's lodged in there, just has a carpet of these on both surfaces. All right, well, the way to clear the rivers of the black flies is to use this rather remarkable biological control agent that is specific to black flies and to mosquitoes. It only kills black flies and mosquitoes. It's harmless to anything else. I've seen dogs drink the slurry, and they like it, and then they're fine 10 years later. So it truly is this quite remarkable natural control agent. And in fact, BTI, the long name is Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis. It's just called BTI. And that's what's used throughout South Carolina, throughout the United States, throughout the world to control especially mosquitoes, but also black flies. And you can just put it into little pools and ponds and so forth, and it's very effective in killing the mosquitoes and doesn't disturb any of the other organisms. This container is enough to kill, when it's applied across the river, all the black flies for about 3 to 5 miles. So it's incredibly potent stuff. All right, well here's the results of the experiment, and all you really have to look at here are the colors. Okay, this is before the black flies were removed. The blue means nest failed. So from 2005 to 2009, actually went on down to 2010, but I couldn't get it all on there. All you see here is blue, nest failures. Here's one that started a second nest after the first one failed. Here's another second nester and another second nester. When they start late, they have a pretty good likelihood of succeeding. Right? All right, after we had removed the black flies, we didn't really remove all of them, and that's an impossibility, but we really knocked the population of black flies way down. And our expectation was that if black flies were causing the problem, if you take that problem away, then the whooping cranes should start staying on their nests and producing chicks. All right, so what you see over here during the experiment, 2011 and 2012, is a lot of yellow. Yellow means a chick hatched. Green means that they incubated full term. They stayed on the nest the whole time. They never got up, but the egg didn't hatch. Something was wrong. Maybe the egg was not fertile. Okay, but what you see after the black fly removal experiment is a lot of yellow and green. All right? Another way to look at this is that the flies, before getting rid of them, were in great numbers on the landscape. That's before the treatment. After we applied the BTI and got rid of the black flies, 6 of the 20 nests in 2011 went full term. 13 of 22 went full term in 2012. And that resulted in 4 eggs hatching in 2011 and 8 eggs hatching in 2012. Up to that time, over a period of, I believe it was 10 years, they had only managed 3 chicks. So in 2 years with black flies removed, we had 12 chicks. And the conclusion, black flies were implicated as a cause of nest abandonment. Clearly they're not the only cause. I mean, you still had nest abandonment. But they are a significant cause of nest abandonment.
Oh, wonderful.
All right, this is what we all would like to see, looking out into our backyard, and here they are. And there's a program now in place to try to force these birds to nest later. Stop nesting right there at the beginning of April when the flies are out en masse, and start nesting when the Sandhill Cranes are doing their thing, because they're successful. And so this forced nesting program is I hope, going to have some success. Okay? And I'll leave you with a couple of flies. This is a black fly. It's being devoured by this gigantic robber fly. So here we have another biological control agent. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you. Like you say, you never know what you're going to encounter at a trust talk. I think you have time for a few questions, Susan.
Why hasn't the latitude of the breeding ground been the same as where they're going to, so that they won't do it earlier?
Yeah, why don't they breed them up there?
Yes.
Yeah, because...
No, maybe not, but the same latitude.
Yeah, well, the reason is logistics. That there's an enormous effort. I mean, it's mind-boggling to see the amount of effort that goes into this whooping crane program. And the facilities are in place in Patuxent. They didn't anticipate this problem. The facilities, the personnel, everything is there. To move it is going to be extraordinarily expensive. Where do you put it? Yeah, it's a logistic nightmare.
Yeah.
So when you were collecting the flies and checking the DNA of the blood, was there DNA of more than one type of vertebrate or bird
In a single female.
in a single female?
Yeah, we did find some of those examples. Never in the same fly, never a bird and a mammal, but we did find 2 different species of birds represented by the blood in the abdomen of a single female. Yeah, so you can get a fly that will go feed on, well, a fly, it'll feed on a grouse and then maybe go feed on a willow warbler. Yeah.
How long is it?
Sorry. This one.
Well, it's one of several, but how long is a feeding period for one session?
For a fly,
Yeah,
5 minutes or less.
more or less.
Typically less than 5 minutes. Maybe 3 minutes, probably.
We can check on that with biting flies now if you want. Yeah.
How do we get rid of no-see-ums?
How do you get rid of
Throw
no-see-um?
some of that stuff around?
You know, I'll tell you, of all the biting flies, the horse flies and the no-see-ums are the hardest to get rid of. Mosquitoes are easy, all right? The only problem is there are a lot of breeding grounds. But here's a puddle, you throw in a little BTI. Here's a river where your black fly problem's coming. You put the BTI across, and it addresses the problems. The culicoid, the biting midges, the no-see-ums, they're dispersed out there in the wet soil, and you can't get this BTI effectively into the damp soil, and the larvae are so tiny, you don't really know where they're concentrated in this vast wet area. So it's just extremely difficult to do it the same way. And then you end up, if you want to treat them, using some kind of a spray that is very general that then kills many other insects. And best is personal protection, you put something on.
Yeah.
Okay?
Is the BTI available?
Yeah, we actually have it around here. We get a little tablet. So if somebody has mosquitoes or they have a pool somewhere, then we can tie Carl Olin keeps up.
Is
with
that what the little mosquito rings are?
Yes.
They're made out of BTI?
Yeah, the little mosquito rings are BTI.
Yeah, you can get what they call them briquettes and rings and all kinds. It comes in all.
So you can, if we have a home Maine where we have both mosquitoes and the black flies in abundance, is that available that we could?
Yeah.
You have to make sure that where you're putting it is where they're breeding.
Yeah, you know, it probably will not do any good. I mean, if you're in Maine, oh God, I mean, the biting flies are breeding everywhere. And so I've spent time in New Hampshire around Dixville Notch trying to address the problem there. And we were able to target at least the black fly problem and find where they were breeding. And they have a program that's been in place now that goes out to those target streams. But it requires dedication.
What other animals are endangered by the black fly?
Well, just about all endangered animals are being fed on by one biting fly or another. And it's a matter of the population levels of the biting flies in the area where those endangered species are.
So it's a matter of management of the problem?
Sometimes it's luck. You know, if the species that's endangered happens to be restricted to an area where the biting fly populations, for whatever reason, maybe there isn't breeding habitat for the flies, it's not located, then by luck, there's not going to be a problem.
Austin. Yeah.
What happened to the 2012, 13, and 14?
Yeah. All right. In 2011, 2012, that was our experiment. In 2013, we continued to monitor, and what we expected was that once we allowed the flies to come back, that the cranes would stop nesting again.
Right.
Well, 2013 was a crazy year. It was a terrible winter, and the black flies did not begin emerging until almost a month later.
Okay.
So the cranes already had a go on it. And this natural experiment of being free of the big bolus of black flies coming out supported the idea that, yeah, when the flies aren't there, they're successful. Then 2014, they sort of coincided, and nest failure happened again.
Yeah. Jack?
Yeah, I mean, Peter, it's not like these flies are something new that just came on. I mean,
That's right.
you know, back in 1800s, 1900s, I mean, did we see population declines like whooping cranes or others that might coincide with, let's say, huge fly populations?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. And the answer is probably no, because, you know, for eons, these flies and these wildlife species have coexisted, and there's a balance. And really, the wildlife populations almost require the biting flies. Otherwise, you know, they're going to, at times, outstrip their resources if the populations aren't kept in check. What happens is a result of what we, as humans, have done. In development, we get rid of prime habitat, which would be in areas like Chicago where you don't have biting fly problems, and they weren't problems historically. So the cranes knew where to nest. Now here we are faced with this bird that's lost all of its habitat, and we're trying to find a place where we can reintroduce it. And so the scientists look carefully at all these different areas. It has to be an area that's protected, like a wildlife refuge. It has to have a lot of food, has to have enough water.
It has to be a place humans didn't want to be.
That's right, and so they chose this area of Wisconsin thinking it was ideal. Well, it wasn't ideal, and so now there's this massive problem to address, but we caused the problem.
Time for a couple more questions. Charles, then.
Peter, we're taught in nature everything's interconnected. I'm interested, does anything depend on the black fly larva? In other words, if you take black fly larva out,
Yes.
what do you affect?
Yes. So budding scientists in here, all of you, seriously, that's a wonderful question. And the answer is that they play a very significant role in many ways, because those fecal pellets that they produce not only fertilize the floodplains, but they serve as a little, like a cracker that gets bacteria all over it, and then it's sort of a cracker with peanut butter on it now, which can then be consumed by a larger insect in the stream, and then that insect is fed on by a fish, or that insect comes out and it's fed on by a bird. And so it all goes back to this base, which is really the black flies. And there's the direct feeding as well. I mean, fish and birds can feed on the larvae directly. They don't have to rely on the fecal pellets to get the indirect effect. So yes, they're extraordinarily important. And if they were removed from an ecosystem, a stream or river, it is going to significantly and negatively influence that stream. And the fishermen would certainly tell you that's...
Ed.
Yeah, I have a question. This is a huge effort. It's been ongoing. It's obviously very expensive. You know, where is the funding coming from, and will it be continued?
Well, for George Archibald, who's the founder of the International Crane Foundation, will be here in about a month, I think. So we're going to have a chance to ask him questions about the cranes.
There you go. George Archibald is a miracle worker. And the answer to your question is George Archibald.
He's got the big checkbook, huh?
Well,
No, he knows who has the big
he knows.
checkbook.
Yeah, he knows.
It's another opportunity to help things around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
George Archibald has created the International Crane Foundation. It employs 40 people.
So you're saying it's privately funded?
Yeah.
It is.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah.
You go ahead, Nancy.
There was an article in the New York Times about the effect of climate change on mosquitoes and moose,
Yes.
and how they were affecting the moose population. So is climate change going to affect these black flies?
Yeah,
Yes.
the question is climate change going to affect the black flies like it has been affecting the moose, is what they were.
Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes. That are,
Yeah. We can say almost with certainty that it will. What we can't really predict is all of the different effects that might be felt, right? But as climate warms, and the area that is really affected most significantly right now is up there in the far north. You get mosquitoes that are moving into areas that normally lived southward, and there are mosquitoes that transmit West Nile virus, so the virus is moving northward into not only wildlife areas that have never been exposed to those diseases, but also human Native American populations that are up there too. So yes, there are going to be influences. They're happening now. They're being detected in those far northern areas and also high elevations, but all of the effects, we have no idea at this point.
you had a question?
Oh, if whooping cranes can survive and thrive and multiply in Chicago, I presume they can't because of the tall buildings, but why couldn't we put them on a different latitude and help them to survive, say, in Michigan or Iowa?
Yeah, well, the idea is that once the population is large enough and self-sustaining, that those cranes would then find areas that were suitable, and they would move out from there. So the idea is that the cranes would sort of do the rest of the picture. When George Archibald, the CEO and president of the International Crane Foundation, is here, he can talk to you about the whooping crane situation, because there are programs in Louisiana and other areas to try to get these populations established. So there are efforts in different areas.
But Louisiana would be too far south.
Well, they
They
overwinter.
could Tucson and put it on the same latitude as Chicago, wouldn't that work?
Yeah. Well, there are certainly areas in Michigan and Illinois where they might be able to nest, and the flies would not be a problem. This is prime habitat here in Wisconsin in that reintroduction area for the flies. But you can move to other areas, and there may not be a big river going through there to support the flies. The bottom line is that if we can get the populations up to some sustaining level, I think the cranes will figure it out from there. And what we would want to see is a success story like with the Canada geese, peregrine falcons.
Dan, and then what do we do? One more question, and then we'll give a chance if somebody else wants to come up and ask a question of Peter after that. Dan, last question.
Is there any evidence that the decline in the duck populations is related to the fly?
Here the question, is there any evidence that the duck population declines are related to?
Yeah, there is no evidence. There are a number of black flies that will feed on ducks, but they don't have the same effect as far as we know. And they do transmit disease agents, and the duck populations will cycle. So some of that cycling might in fact be a result of black flies, but we don't pick it up because people aren't out there watching this sort of thing. I mean, it was remarkably, it was quite a number of years before a very astute wildlife biologist said, what is all of that flying around this crane? And he called me on the phone. He said, do you think black flies could cause this problem? Okay. Now these are people who had been watching the cranes and they weren't even aware of it. So it's not that easy. These are tiny little flies. And it's hard to get close to those animals.
All right, Peter, thank you very, very much.